An old man with a broken furnace turned away a war widow and her deaf son on the coldest night of the year. 3 hours later, his own granddaughter found them in the bed of a pickup truck behind the hardware store. What she uncovered that night would unravel a secret he'd buried for 40 years, cost him the one relationship he had left, and finally answer the question that had haunted him since 1983, why he never let anyone get close enough to need him. Walter Brennan was 71 years old, and he had not said a kind word to a stranger in longer than he could remember. He owned a hardware store on the edge of Cedar Falls, a town in northern Iowa where the wind came down off the plains in January like it had a grudge. The store had been his father's before it was his, and Walter had spent 50 years behind that counter selling nails and pipe fittings and snow shovels to people whose names he knew but whose lives he kept at arm's length. He opened at 7. He closed at 6. He ate his lunch alone in the back room standing up, because sitting down felt like giving in to something. People in town called him cheap. They weren't wrong, exactly, but they weren't right either. Walter wasn't cheap with money. He was cheap with himself. He gave nothing away that might cost him anything, and he had decided a long time ago that the most expensive thing a man could give was his attention. So he kept it. He hoarded it like the rest of them hoarded firewood. He'd been married once. Her name was Eleanor, and she'd left him in 1991 with a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I can't keep loving a locked door." He still had the note. It was in a drawer somewhere, yellowed now, the ink gone soft. He told himself he kept it because he was a man who didn't throw things away, but that wasn't the truth, and somewhere underneath all the years he knew it. He had one daughter, Carol, who lived in Des Moines and called on Sundays out of duty rather than warmth, and one granddaughter, Maddie, who was 24 and had moved back to Cedar Falls the year before to teach 3rd grade. Maddie was the only person on earth who still came around without a reason. She'd stop by the store on her way home, lean on the counter, tell him about her kids at school, the ones who couldn't read yet, the one whose mother was in jail, the quiet boy who flinched when anyone raised a hand near him. Walter never said much, but he listened. He always listened to Maddie. She was the one crack in the wall, and he didn't have the heart to seal it. It was the 3rd week of January when the woman came in. The temperature that day had bottomed out at 9 below, and the wind chill dragged it down past 20. Walter had a space heater going behind the counter and a sign in the window that said, "Open," even though he was thinking about closing early. Most days, nobody came in after 4 when it got that cold, but at 5:15, the bell over the door rang, and a gust of frozen air rolled in across the floor, and a woman stepped inside holding the hand of a small boy. She was maybe 30, thin, in a way that wasn't natural. Her coat was too big for her, an army surplus thing, olive drab, the kind a person buys when they've stopped buying clothes for how they look. The boy beside her was 7 or 8, bundled in a snowsuit that was a size too small, his wrist sticking out past the cuffs, red and chapped. He held a flashlight in his free hand, one of those cheap plastic ones, and he was clicking it on and off, watching the beam appear and disappear against the floor. "Help you?" Walter said. He didn't look up from the receipts he was sorting. "I hope so." The woman's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something wound tight. "I'm looking for a part. A thermocouple. For an oil furnace, an old Williamson. The pilot won't stay lit." Walter looked up then. He knew that furnace. There were maybe a dozen of them still running in this town. All of them in the rental houses out on Sycamore where the landlord, a man named Dale Putnam, hadn't replaced a furnace since the Carter administration. "You out on Sycamore?" "Number 11. We just moved in last month." Walter nodded slowly. He came around the counter and went to the back wall where he kept the furnace parts, the old stock nobody else carried anymore because nobody else bothered. He found the thermocouple, the right one, and he set it on the counter. He could see her counting in her head before she even asked the price. "How much?" $14. She opened a small change purse. He watched her count it out. Singles mostly, and a fan of coins she spread across her palm. She came up short. He could see it in her face before she said anything, the particular way a person's expression collapses inward when the numbers don't work. "I have 9, she said. I'll have the rest Friday. I get paid Friday. I just. She stopped. The boy clicked his flashlight on and off. It's supposed to get to 15 below tonight. The furnace went out this morning. I've got space heaters, but only 2 of them. And the wiring in that house, I don't trust it. I can't run 3 at once or it trips the breaker, and I've got him and the baby and. $14, Walter said. She looked at him. He hadn't meant it cruelly. That was the thing he would turn over in his mind for a long time afterward. He hadn't meant it cruelly at all. He'd just said the number again, the way he always said the number again. Because the number was the number, and the world ran on the number. And he had spent 50 years behind that counter learning that the second you let the number bend for one person, it bent for everyone. And then where were you? His father had taught him that. You give a man a discount once, he'll think you owe it to him forever. Please, she said. It was almost a whisper. The boy had stopped clicking the flashlight. He was watching his mother's face. Come back Friday with the 14, Walter said, and he slid the thermocouple back toward himself, off the counter into his hand. Part'll be here. She stood there a moment longer. Whatever she'd been holding together since she walked in, he watched it hold a little tighter. Watched her decide not to let it go in front of the boy. She nodded once. Okay, she said. Thank you for your time. She took the boy's hand. At the door the kid turned and looked back at Walter, and he raised the flashlight and clicked it on, pointed it right at him, the little beam catching Walter square in the chest, and then he clicked it off, and they were gone into the dark and the cold. Walter put the thermocouple back on the shelf. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He told himself a lot of things in the 40 minutes before he locked up and went home to his own house with its own working furnace and its own silence, and he believed about half of them. What he didn't know was her name yet. He'd learn it later. Rosa Delgado, 31, widow of a man named Hector Delgado, who had been killed 18 months earlier in a place she could barely stand to say out loud, a place with a name that meant nothing to anyone in Cedar Falls. She had a folded flag in a box she hadn't opened since the funeral. She had a 7-year-old son named Mateo, who had been born deaf in one ear and lost most of the hearing in the other after a fever at age 4, and who carried a flashlight everywhere because the dark was a place where he couldn't read lips and couldn't hear, and so he kept a light to push it back. She had a baby girl named Lucia, 14 months old, asleep right now in a borrowed car seat in a cold house on Sycamore Street. Walter didn't know any of that. He only knew he'd said the number twice and meant it, and that the boy had pointed a flashlight at his heart like he was looking for something there and hadn't found it. Maddie Brennan got off work at 3:30 that day, but she stayed late grading papers, and then she stopped at the grocery store, and then she remembered she'd promised her grandfather she'd drop off the soup her mother had made and frozen and mailed in a cooler. Because Carol worried about Walter eating right and didn't trust him to do it himself. So it was almost 8 by the time Maddie pulled into the alley behind the hardware store, because that was where the side door to the upstairs storage was, the one her grandfather kept the cooler in. Her headlight swung across the back lot as she turned in, and they caught something. There was a truck back there, not her grandfather's, an old Ford, rust along the wheel wells, parked at the edge of the lot near the dumpster where the street light didn't reach, and in the bed of it, under the topper, behind the fogged plastic window, there was movement. A shape, more than one shape. Maddie sat in her car for a second with her heart picking up. This was the kind of thing you were supposed to drive away from. Call somebody, don't get out. But she could see, now that her eyes adjusted, that the shapes were small. And then one of them moved, and a tiny point of light clicked on inside the truck bed, a little flashlight beam, sweeping once across the plastic, and she understood she was looking at a child. She got out of the car. The cold hit her like a wall. She walked toward the truck slowly, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel, and she said, "Hello? Is somebody? Are you okay back there?" The flashlight clicked off. She got to the back of the truck and looked through the foggy plastic, and what she saw stopped her cold in a way the weather hadn't. A woman sitting up against the cab, a baby zipped inside her coat against her chest so that only the top of the baby's head showed. A boy lying with his head in the woman's lap, a flashlight clutched in both hands. They were under a pile of blankets and what looked like a moving pad, the gray kind you rent with a U-Haul. The woman's eyes were open. She was looking right at Maddie, and her face had the particular stillness of someone who has already decided she will not beg and will not cry and will simply absorb whatever is coming next. "Oh my God," Maddie said. "Oh my God, it's freezing. How long have you been out here?" The woman didn't answer right away. The boy sat up. He looked at his mother's face, watching her mouth, and then he looked at Maddie, watching hers. "The shelter in Waterloo is full," the woman finally said. "I called. They said try tomorrow. Our furnace went out. I couldn't keep the house warm enough for the baby. The truck holds heat better than the house does if I run it. I run it 20 minutes, then off, so the carbon monoxide doesn't. I've been doing the math all night. We're okay. We're managing." "You're in a parking lot in 15 below," Maddie said. "We're managing," the woman said again, and her voice cracked just slightly on the second word, a hairline fracture in something that had been holding for a long time. Maddie Brennan was 24 years old, and she had been raised by a mother who'd been raised by Walter, which meant she had inherited a certain bloodline of restraint, a family tendency to keep your hands in your pockets and your heart behind glass. But Maddie had broken with all of that somewhere along the way. She taught 3rd grade in a town that was losing its young people, and she had learned that the only thing worth anything in this life was showing up for somebody. So she didn't call the police. She didn't call 211. She didn't reach for the apparatus that would take this off her hands and file it into a system. She opened the tailgate. "Come with me," she said. "All of you, right now. I've got a heated apartment and a couch that pulls out, and I am not driving away from this." The woman stared at her. "I don't know you." "I know," Maddie said. "But that baby's cheeks are red, and it's only going to get colder. Please, I'm not asking you to trust me forever. I'm asking you to trust me for one night." The boy was watching his mother's mouth. The mother looked at her son and at the baby against her chest, and she made the calculation that mothers make, the one that has nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the math of small bodies and cold air. She nodded. It took 2 trips to get everything. The car seat, a duffel bag, a milk crate of belongings, the boy's backpack. Maddie buckled them in and turned the heat up full and drove the 8 minutes to her apartment with her hands shaking on the wheel. Not from cold. It was inside, in the light of her kitchen, that she got the first real look at them. Rosa, the mother, gave her name finally, and the boys, Mateo, and the babies, Lucia. Maddie made grilled cheese sandwiches because it was what she had, and the boy ate 3, and the way he ate them, fast and quiet, his eyes down, told her more than anything Rosa said out loud. Maddie warmed milk for the baby. She found extra blankets. She did not ask too many questions, because she'd learned that from her grandfather without ever meaning to, that sometimes the kindest thing is to not make a person explain themselves. It was almost midnight when she texted him. She didn't plan to, but she was sitting at her kitchen table watching this family sleep in her living room. A war widow and a deaf boy and a baby, all of them safe and warm now, and she thought about her grandfather alone in his house with his working furnace, and she typed, without quite knowing why, "Grandpa, found a family sleeping in a truck behind your store tonight, in this cold. Their furnace died. Brought them home. People are really out here freezing, Grandpa. It's bad this year." She didn't expect an answer. He never answered texts at night. But 3 dots appeared. Then they vanished. Then nothing. What Maddie didn't know was that Walter Brennan was sitting in his kitchen too at that exact hour, holding his phone in a hand that had gone cold, reading the words behind your store and feeling the floor tilt under him. Because he knew. The moment he read it, he knew. The thermocouple, number 11, Sycamore. The boy with the flashlight, pointing it at his chest in the doorway like he was searching for a heart and not finding one. He did not text back. He turned to the phone face down on the table, and he sat there in the dark for a long time. And an old man who had not cried since the Reagan administration found his throat closing in a way he could not control. He drove to Maddie's apartment at 6:40 the next morning. He hadn't slept. He had a part in his coat pocket, the thermocouple. The right one, the $14 one, and he didn't even fully know why he'd brought it. Maddie answered the door in her robe, surprised. "Grandpa, what are you?" "That family," he said. His voice came out rough. "The one in the truck. Did she come into the store yesterday? Tall, boy with a flashlight?" Maddie's face changed. "How did you know that?" He didn't answer. He looked past her into the apartment, and there at the kitchen table sat Rosa Delgado feeding oatmeal to a baby in a high chair Maddie had borrowed from a neighbor across the hall an hour earlier. And the boy Mateo stood at the counter rinsing a bowl, doing it carefully, doing it without being asked. And when he turned and saw Walter standing in the doorway, his whole small body went rigid. He recognized him. Of course he recognized him. He pointed a flashlight at this man's chest in the dark, not 12 hours before. Rosa looked up. Her face when she saw Walter was something Walter would carry for the rest of his life. It was not anger. He almost wished it had been anger. It was just recognition. The flat, tired recognition of a woman who has learned that the world is full of closed doors and has stopped being surprised by them. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly. "Can I talk to you?" Walter said to Maddie. "Not a question." In the hallway, with the door pulled mostly shut, Maddie stared at her grandfather. "You know her? How do you know her?" "She came into the store yesterday afternoon for the furnace part." He had to force the words out. "She was $9 short of 14, and I sent her away." The hallway was very quiet. "She told me it was going to be 15 below," Walter said. "She told me she had kids. And I said the number again. I just said the number again." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. "Maddie, she had $5 short of a part that would have kept that furnace lit, and I let her walk out into that." "Grandpa." Maddie's voice was careful. "Why, you're not a cruel man. Why would you do that?" And Walter Brennan, who had spent 40 years not answering exactly this question, who had let a marriage die rather than answer it, who had kept his own daughter at arm's length and let his attention curdle into stinginess because attention was the one thing that could cost you everything, stood in the hallway of his granddaughter's apartment building and felt the answer come up out of him like something breaking loose from the bottom of a frozen lake. "In 1983, he said, "I turned a man away from the store." Maddie waited. It was December, cold like this. A man came in, fella named Tom Reedy, worked at the packing plant before it closed. He needed a part for his truck so he could get to a job interview in Cedar Rapids the next morning. He was short, not much. $3-4. And my father was standing right there behind me, and my father had drilled it into me. "You don't bend the price? You don't bend the price." And so I didn't bend the price. I told Tom Reedy to come back when he had the money. Walter's voice had gone to almost nothing. He didn't make the interview, couldn't get his truck running, lost the chance at the job. And 2 months later, he stopped. 2 months later, Tom Reedy drove that same truck out to the river, and he didn't come back. And everybody said it was the money troubles, the work drying up, the whole town falling apart, and nobody ever said it was me. Nobody ever once said Walter Brennan's name. But I was the last door that closed on that man. I was $3. And I have spent 40 years telling myself that if I never let the number bend, then it could never be my fault again. Because the number is the number. And the number isn't a choice. And a man can't be guilty of arithmetic. He looked at his granddaughter, and his eyes were wet, and he was 71 years old. "But it's always a choice, Maddie. That's the thing I knew and couldn't stand to know. Every single time, it's a choice. And I made it again yesterday. I looked at that woman and her boy, and I made the exact same choice, and I told myself the exact same lie, and the only difference is this time you found them before the river did." Maddie didn't say anything. She put her arms around her grandfather, this man who had never once in her life initiated a hug, and she held on. And after a long moment, she felt his arms come up and close around her back, stiff and unpracticed, like a door that hadn't been opened in so long the hinges had rusted shut. Then he pulled back, and he wiped his face with the flat of his hand, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out the thermocouple. "That furnace is going to be the death of somebody in one of Dale Putnam's houses," he said, and his voice had changed, Had something in it Maddie hadn't heard before. Something with a spine. Not this family. Not while I'm breathing. Where's the boy? They went back inside. Walter crossed the kitchen and crouched down, his old knees protesting in front of Mateo, so they were at eye level. He held up the thermocouple. He pointed at it, then pointed in the direction of Sycamore Street, then made a turning motion with his hand like fixing something. The boy watched his face, his hands, reading all of it. Walter pointed at the boy, then at himself, then made the turning motion again. You, me, we fix it. Mateo looked at his mother. Rosa, her eyes shining, nodded. The boy clicked his flashlight on and shined it at Walter's chest, the same as he had in the store, the same searching beam. But this time Walter didn't flinch from it. He let the boy hold the light there, and then he reached up, slow, and gently turned the boy's wrist so the beam swung up to point at Walter's face instead, lit it up, every line and crag of it, so the boy could see him clearly, so the boy could read him. So, there was nothing hidden. Mateo studied his face for a long moment in the little circle of light. Then he smiled. Walter Brennan fixed the furnace at number 11 Sycamore that morning, with Mateo holding the flashlight steady on the burner assembly, while Walter's cold, stiff fingers worked the new part into place. It took 20 minutes. It had always only been a 20-minute fix. That was the part that would sit in his chest like a stone for the rest of his days. That the thing standing between this family and a warm night had been 20 minutes and $5 and a man who wouldn't bend. But the furnace was only the beginning, and Walter knew it, because a thermocouple doesn't fix a house owned by Dale Putnam, who'd been collecting rent on a dozen unsafe houses for 30 years while the families inside them froze and trusted that somebody, somewhere, was supposed to be looking out for them. So Walter did something he had never done in his life. He got involved. He drove out to see Dale Putnam that afternoon, and nobody knows exactly what was said in that conversation. But Dale Putnam replaced 4 furnaces before March, and people noticed, and people talked, and the talk had Walter Brennan's name in it for the first time in a long time, attached to something other than the word cheap. Rosa and the children stayed in number 11, but everything else changed. Walter found out, because he started asking questions, that Rosa had been a certified nursing assistant before Hector died, that she'd let her certification lapse in the 18 months of grief and survival, and that the only thing standing between her and steady work was a $400 recertification course and someone to watch the kids while she took it. Walter paid for the course. He called it a business expense and refused to explain how. And when Rosa was in class, the baby Lucia spent her afternoons at the hardware store in a playpen Walter set up behind the counter, and customers who'd known Walter Brennan for 50 years walked in to find the old man making faces at a 14-month-old and losing. Mateo came to the store after school. Walter learned 40 words of sign language from a library book, badly, his old hands clumsy with it, and Mateo corrected him, patiently, the way you'd correct the child, and something passed between the old man and the boy that neither of them had words for in any language. Walter taught him how the register worked, how to count change, how to look a customer in the eye. And he never once made the boy feel like the silence in his ears was a thing that needed fixing. Maddie watched all of it happen and understood that she had not, in fact, rescued that family from a truck bed on a cold night. She had rescued her grandfather. She had found him, the real him, the one who'd been frozen under 40 years of ice, and she'd pulled him out before the cold took him for good. Rosa got her certification back in the spring. She took a job at the county nursing home, good hours, benefits, a path. The first month, she tried to pay Walter back for the course, counting out the bills on the counter the way she'd counted them out that first day. And Walter pushed the money back across the wood and told her to put it in a savings account for the boy's future, and when she started to argue, he said, in the gruff voice of a man still uncomfortable with his own heart, that he was being practical, that a man with a head for numbers knew a good investment when he saw one, and that this was the best one he'd made in 50 years. There's a thing people say, that it takes a village. Walter used to hate that saying. He thought it was an excuse, a way for people to make their problems, everybody's problems, and he built his whole life on the opposite idea, that every man stands alone and pays his own way and bends for nothing. He'd been so sure of it that he'd let it cost him a wife, a daughter, 40 years, and once, a long time ago, a man named Tom Reedy who drove out to the river over $3. He had it backward the whole time. It was never that you stand alone. It's that you're already in the village, whether you admit it or not, already connected to every person who walks through your door, already holding in your hands the power to be the door that opens or the door that closes. He thought keeping his attention to himself made him safe. It only made him cold. Walter Brennan died 4 years later at 75 in his sleep in a house that was no longer silent because Rosa and the kids had moved into the upstairs apartment after Maddie helped him see he had more room than he had life left to fill it with. At the funeral, the church was full, which surprised everyone who'd known the cheap old man behind the counter, and didn't surprise anyone who'd known him the last 4 years. Matteo, 11 years old now, stood at the front. He didn't speak, because speaking wasn't his language. He held up a flashlight instead, and he clicked it on, and he shined it out over all of them, slow. The whole room, the way you'd sweep a light across a dark place looking for something. And then he held it steady on the photograph of Walter at the front of the church, lit up his old, creased face. Every line of it, nothing hidden. And everyone in that room understood. Here's the part we're sitting with. The cost of keeping that family warm was $14.20. The cost of turning them away was very nearly a life, the same way it had been 40 years before. The math never changes. What changes is whether you let yourself feel it. Roughly 500,000 people in this country will be homeless on any given night, and a great many of them are one closed door, one small number, one bent or not bent decision, away from something nobody ever has to know your name to be guilty of. You will never know which door you are until somebody is standing in front of you, cold, asking. Walter Brennan was the last door for 2 men in his life. He closed it on the first one, and the only reason he opened it for the second was that a young woman with her hands out of her pockets refused to drive past a truck in a parking lot. Be the one who stops. It is almost never as expensive as you think, and the bill for driving past comes due, whether you look at it or not. The thing I keep coming back to is how small the number was. $14. 20 minutes of work. That's all that stood between a family and a warm night, and a man chose to let it stand. I've turned that over in my mind more times than I can count. And what I've come to believe is that Walter Brennan wasn't a cruel man at all. He was a frightened one. And fear, when you let it harden long enough, starts to look exactly like cruelty from the outside. What ruined him for 40 years wasn't a lack of kindness in his heart. It was a story he told himself about safety. He decided after Tom Reedy that if he never let the number bend, he could never be blamed again. Because numbers aren't choices, and a man can't be guilty of arithmetic. But that was the lie. Every closed door is a choice, every single one. And the moment you understand that, you can't hide behind the math anymore. That's the hard, clear-eyed thinking it took him a lifetime to reach, and most of us never reach it at all. I think about Maddie a lot too, because she's the one who actually changed things, and she did it by refusing to drive past. That's the part people forget. Compassion isn't only what you feel when you see somebody cold in a parking lot. Compassion is getting out of the warm car. It's the willingness to make a stranger's problem your problem when every voice in your head and your whole family bloodline is telling you to keep your hands in your pockets. And then there's the endurance of it, which I find almost unbearable to sit with. Rosa Delgado lost her husband, lost her hearing in a son, ran the carbon monoxide math in a truck bed all night so her baby wouldn't freeze, and never once let herself break in front of her children. That kind of steadiness under that kind of weight isn't softness. It's the strongest thing a person can do, and it usually goes unwitnessed. If I've learned anything from a story like this, it's that the good life asks 3 things of you that all pull in the same direction. It asks you to choose the open door even when the number tells you not to. It asks you to think honestly enough to see your own excuses for what they are, the way Walter finally saw his. And it asks you to keep standing when standing is the only thing left, the way Rosa did in that cold. Walter got 4 good years because a young woman stopped her car. That's the whole math of it. The bill for driving past comes due either way, and the only thing you ever really decide is whether you'll be the door that opens. I hope, when somebody's standing in front of me with their hands out, I have the sense to remember it costs less than I think,